I sat in the mahogany-paneled law office as Grandpa Edmund's attorney read the will. When Lawyer Harrison slid a $19 million check across the table toward me, my parents, Diana and Robert, exploded. Diana lunged forward, ripping the check from my stunned hands while Robert shouted about unfairness. Without hesitation, Diana flicked her gold lighter and set the check ablaze, the paper curling into ash on the marble conference table. I watched calmly, a knowing smile spreading across my face. My parents had no idea what they just destroyed was exactly what I wanted them to burn. 3 months before that moment in Harrison's office, I never could have imagined my parents were capable of such cruelty. I had just lost my marketing job at a tech startup in Boston when the company folded, leaving me with nothing but student loan debt and uncertainty about my future. When my mother Diana called suggesting I move back to help care for Grandpa Edmund at his sprawling Connecticut estate, it seemed like the perfect solution. I could save money on rent while spending quality time with the grandfather who had practically raised me after Grandma Margaret died when I was 12. Edmund's colonial farmhouse sat on 200 acres of rolling hills and apple orchards that had belonged to our family for 4 generations. The property felt like stepping back in time, with its wide front porch, original hardwood floors, and stone fireplaces that Edmund kept burning throughout the winter months. I had always loved visiting during summers, helping Edmund tend his vegetable garden, and listening to his stories about growing up during the Great Depression. But when I arrived that September, something felt different. Edmund seemed smaller somehow, more fragile than I remembered. Diana and Robert were there constantly, hovering around him with concerned expressions and speaking to him in the slow, deliberate tones people use with children. They explained that Edmund was developing dementia and needed constant supervision to keep him safe. During my first week back, I noticed strange inconsistencies in Edmund's behavior that troubled me. Every morning when I brought him coffee on the front porch, he would be sharp and engaged, asking detailed questions about my job search and offering thoughtful advice about my career plans. We would discuss current events, and his knowledge of politics and economics impressed me as always. But by afternoon, something would change. Edmund would become confused and disoriented, forgetting conversations we had just finished and struggling to complete simple tasks like buttoning his shirts. The transformation was so dramatic that I began paying closer attention to his daily routine. Diana prepared all of Edmund's meals, insisting that he needed a special diet to manage his blood pressure and cholesterol levels. She would bring him pills 3 times daily, explaining they were for various health conditions that required careful monitoring. Robert handled all of Edmund's financial affairs, claiming the old man could no longer be trusted to manage his accounts properly. One afternoon while Edmund was napping, I was tidying up the kitchen when I accidentally knocked over Diana's purse. The contents spilled across the floor, and I was surprised to find several prescription bottles that didn't belong to my mother. The labels showed Edmund's name, but the medications were for anxiety and sleep disorders that I had never heard him mention. When I asked Diana about them later, she became defensive and irritated, explaining that Edmund's doctor had prescribed them to help manage his agitation and ensure he got proper rest. That evening, I decided to do some research online about the medications I had seen. What I discovered made my stomach turn. The combination of drugs Diana was giving Edmund could cause severe cognitive impairment, especially in elderly patients. The dosages were high enough to keep someone in a constant state of confusion and dependency. I realized that my beloved grandfather wasn't developing dementia naturally. He was being systematically drugged to keep him docile and controllable. The next morning, I watched carefully as Diana prepared Edmund's coffee, and I saw her crush a white pill into the cup before stirring it thoroughly. When she left the room to answer a phone call, I quickly poured the coffee into a houseplant and made Edmund a fresh cup from the pot. The difference was remarkable. Within an hour, Edmund was alert and conversational, asking me specific questions about my marketing experience and suggesting companies I should consider applying to work for. Over the following days, I began documenting everything I observed. I took photos of the prescription bottles, noting the dosages and frequency. I started keeping a journal of Edmund's behavior patterns, recording how his mental clarity correlated with whether he had consumed the drugged food and drinks Diana prepared. The evidence was overwhelming. My parents were poisoning my grandfather to maintain control over him. The most devastating discovery came when I found a folder hidden in Robert's study containing financial documents that revealed the true scope of their betrayal. Edmund's bank statements showed regular withdrawals of large amounts of cash that had no corresponding expenses. Investment accounts that should have contained hundreds of thousands of dollars were nearly empty. Robert had been systematically draining Edmund's savings while convincing him that his investments were performing poorly due to market conditions. I found copies of checks that had been forged with Edmund's signature, authorizing transfers to accounts controlled by my parents. There were loan documents showing that Diana and Robert had borrowed against Edmund's property without his knowledge, using forged power of attorney papers to complete the transactions. They had been stealing from him for over 2 years, and the total amount exceeded $800,000. When I confronted Robert in his study one evening, surrounded by the evidence of his crimes, he broke down completely. Through tears, he admitted that he and Diana were facing bankruptcy from failed business ventures and accumulated gambling debts. Robert had invested their retirement savings in a restaurant that failed within 6 months, and Diana had been hiding credit card debt from expensive shopping trips and luxury vacations they couldn't afford. Robert begged me to understand that they were desperate, facing threats from creditors and possible foreclosure on their own home. He claimed they never intended to hurt Edmund permanently, just needed time to get back on their feet financially. But I felt sick realizing that my parents had been systematically abusing the grandfather who had shown them nothing but love and generosity throughout their lives. The folder also contained documents showing that Robert had convinced Edmund to sign over power of attorney during one of his heavily drugged states, giving my parents complete control over his finances and medical decisions. They had used this authority to isolate Edmund from his friends and other family members, claiming he was too sick to receive visitors or handle his own affairs. As I sat in Edmund's study that night, looking through decades of family photos and memorabilia, I realized that my parents' greed had not only stolen his money but robbed him of his dignity and independence during what should have been his golden years. I knew I had to find a way to protect Edmund and expose their crimes, but I also understood that I was dealing with people who had already demonstrated they would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. The following week, I decided to take action to document my parents' ongoing abuse. Using money from my dwindling savings account, I purchased small, hidden cameras from an electronics store and carefully installed them throughout Edmund's house. I placed devices in the kitchen where Diana prepared his meals, the living room where they pressured him to sign documents, and Edmund's bedroom where they administered his medications. The footage I captured over the next several days was more disturbing than I had imagined. I watched Diana crushing pills into Edmund's morning oatmeal while humming cheerfully, as if drugging an elderly man was just another household chore. I recorded Robert sitting beside a confused Edmund, guiding his trembling hand to sign papers while speaking in soothing tones about how the documents would help protect his assets for the family. The cameras captured conversations between my parents when they thought Edmund was sleeping. Diana complained about how long it was taking for Edmund to go naturally, suggesting they might need to increase his medication dosages to speed up the process. Robert worried about leaving evidence of their activities, but Diana dismissed his concerns, saying that once Edmund was gone, no one would question their management of his affairs. I photographed financial statements showing that Edmund's investment portfolio, which had once been worth over $1 million, had been reduced to less than $50,000 through unauthorized withdrawals and transfers. Bank records revealed that my parents had been using Edmund's accounts to pay their personal expenses, including mortgage payments on their own home, luxury car leases, and expensive dining bills. But the most shocking revelation came when I discovered real estate transfer documents hidden in Robert's briefcase. My parents had been systematically transferring Edmund's properties into their own names through forged paperwork. The beautiful family farm that had been passed down through 4 generations was now legally owned by Diana and Robert, along with 2 rental properties in nearby towns that Edmund had purchased as investments decades earlier. The transfer documents were accompanied by correspondence with real estate developers who wanted to purchase the farm for commercial development. A national retail chain had offered $12 million for the property, planning to build a shopping complex and parking lots where Edmund's apple orchards and pastures currently stood. My parents had already signed preliminary agreements and were waiting for Edmund's death to complete the sale. I realized that Diana and Robert weren't just stealing money from Edmund, they were planning to destroy his entire legacy. The farm represented everything Edmund valued: family history, connection to the land, and the simple pleasures of rural life. The idea of bulldozers tearing down the barns where Edmund stored his antique farming equipment and paving over the gardens where he grew vegetables for the local food bank made me physically ill. When I confronted Diana separately, Playing audio recordings of her conversations with Robert about selling the farm, she became hysterical. She screamed that I had no right to spy on them and didn't understand the financial pressure they were facing. Diana claimed that creditors were calling daily, threatening legal action and repossession of their belongings. She insisted that Edmund wouldn't live much longer anyway, and questioned why valuable property should sit unused when it could solve their immediate problems. Robert's reaction was different but equally disturbing. When I showed him photographs of the forged documents, he tried to justify their actions by arguing that Edmund had no other family to inherit his wealth, and that Diana and I would eventually receive everything when he died. Robert suggested that they were simply accelerating an inevitable process and ensuring the assets were used productively rather than being tied up in legal proceedings. Neither of my parents showed any genuine remorse for betraying Edmund's trust or stealing his life savings. They seemed to view him as an obstacle preventing them from accessing money they believed they deserved. Their attitude toward Edmund had shifted from loving children caring for an aging parent to predators waiting for their victim to die so they could claim their prize. I spent hours researching elder abuse laws and was horrified to learn how common financial exploitation of elderly people had become. According to government statistics, family members committed the majority of elder financial abuse cases, stealing an estimated $36 billion annually from vulnerable seniors. The average victim lost over $100,000, and many never recovered financially or emotionally from the betrayal. I reached out to Harrison Webb, the family attorney who had represented Edmund for over 30 years. Harrison had handled Edmund's business affairs since the 1970s and had witnessed the births of both my father and myself. When I explained what I had discovered, Harrison was shocked and deeply saddened. He remembered officiating at Edmund's wedding to Margaret and couldn't believe their children would repay his love with such cruelty. Harrison explained that what my parents were doing constituted multiple serious felonies: elder financial abuse, fraud, forgery, and identity theft. The penalties could include decades in prison and complete financial restitution to Edmund. However, he warned that prosecuting family members was emotionally devastating for elderly victims, who often blamed themselves for trusting the wrong people. Harrison also revealed information that made my parents' crimes even more despicable. Edmund had been planning to divide his estate equally among Robert, Diana, and myself, ensuring everyone would be financially secure. He had also intended to establish a scholarship fund in Margaret's memory to help young women pursue college educations. My parents' greed had not only robbed Edmund but also destroyed his plans to help future generations. As I sat in Harrison's office, reviewing the evidence I had gathered, I realized that simply stopping my parents' abuse wouldn't be enough. They had already stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars and damaged Edmund's health through months of forced medication. Justice required not just protection for Edmund, but accountability for the people who had betrayed his trust so completely. Harrison and I began planning a strategy that would expose my parents' crimes while protecting Edmund from further harm. We agreed that the best approach would be to document their abuse thoroughly, then present the evidence to law enforcement and prosecutors simultaneously. The goal was to ensure my parents faced criminal charges while recovering as much of Edmund's stolen assets as possible. 2 weeks before the scheduled will reading, I was walking past Edmund's study at 2 o'clock in the morning when I noticed light coming from under the closed door. Assuming he had forgotten to turn off a lamp, I quietly opened the door to check on him. What I saw inside changed everything I thought I knew about the situation. Edmund was sitting at his antique oak desk, completely alert and focused, reviewing financial documents with a magnifying glass. When he looked up and saw me standing in the doorway, his eyes were sharp and clear, showing none of the confusion and disorientation that had characterized his behavior during the day. He smiled and gestured for me to come in, saying he had been waiting for me to find him like this. I was stunned as Edmund explained that he had stopped drinking the drugged coffee and eating the medicated food Diana prepared over 3 weeks earlier. Instead, he had been pouring the coffee into the large potted plants in his room and disposing of suspicious food when my parents weren't watching. The dramatic change in his mental clarity had occurred within days of stopping the medication, confirming everything I had suspected about their systematic poisoning. Edmund revealed that he had been pretending to remain confused and dependent while secretly documenting every crime Robert and Diana committed against him. His desk drawer contained a hidden compartment where he stored photocopies of every forged check, every fraudulent property transfer, and every legal document they had pressured him to sign during his drugged states. He had been using a small recording device that Harrison had provided to capture conversations with my parents about their financial schemes. The most painful part of our conversation was listening to Edmund describe the emotional impact of discovering that his own children were systematically robbing him. He said that watching Robert and Diana betray his trust had been more devastating than losing his beloved wife Margaret or surviving 3 heart attacks. Edmund had spent months grieving not just the loss of his money, but the realization that the people he loved most in the world viewed him as nothing more than an obstacle to their financial security. Edmund explained that his decision to pretend continued confusion was strategic rather than emotional. He needed time to gather comprehensive evidence that would ensure Robert and Diana faced serious legal consequences for their actions. He also wanted to protect his assets from further theft while planning a way to expose their crimes publicly. Edmund believed that holding them accountable would prevent them from targeting other elderly victims in the future. Harrison had been helping Edmund document the abuse for several weeks, using his legal expertise to ensure the evidence would be admissible in court. Together, they had developed an elaborate plan to trap Robert and Diana during the will reading, creating a situation where they would reveal their true character in front of multiple witnesses while being recorded by hidden cameras. The centerpiece of their strategy was the fake $19 million check that would be presented to me during the will reading. Edmund explained that he and Harrison had the check printed on realistic bank paper, but it was drawn on an account that had been closed 3 years earlier. The check was completely worthless, but Edmund knew that Robert and Diana would try to steal it from me based on their established pattern of greed and entitlement. Edmund predicted that my parents would be unable to resist the temptation of such a large amount of money, especially since they believed I would be too surprised and intimidated to resist their demands. He expected them to physically take the check from me and possibly destroy it to prevent me from accessing funds they believed belonged to them. Their reaction would demonstrate their willingness to steal from their own daughter in front of witnesses, providing powerful evidence of their criminal mindset. The real genius of Edmund's plan was that his actual assets had been secretly transferred into an irrevocable trust with me as the sole beneficiary. The trust had been established through a separate attorney in New York, completely outside the scope of Robert and Diana's knowledge or influence. All of Edmund's property, investments, and cash holdings were protected from any claims or legal challenges my parents might attempt after his death. Edmund showed me documentation proving that the trust contained significantly more assets than anyone realized. In addition to the family farm and his house, Edmund owned rental properties in 3 states, held stock in major technology companies he had purchased in the 1980s, and had accumulated precious metals and rare coins worth millions of dollars. His total estate was valued at over $40 million, making the fake $19 million check seem modest by comparison. The trust structure also ensured that Robert and Diana would receive nothing from Edmund's estate, despite being his biological children. Edmund had concluded that people willing to drug and rob an elderly parent didn't deserve to inherit wealth. They would likely squander through continued poor financial decisions. Instead, the trust was designed to provide me with substantial annual income while preserving the principal for future generations and charitable purposes. Edmund also revealed that he had prepared a comprehensive legal case against Robert and Diana that would be presented to prosecutors immediately after the will reading. The evidence included not only documentation of their crimes against him, but also information about their attempts to defraud other elderly people through Robert's insurance business. Harrison had discovered that my parents had been running a sophisticated scheme targeting vulnerable seniors for financial exploitation. As we talked through the night, I was amazed by Edmund's strategic thinking and attention to detail. Despite being the victim of systematic abuse, he had managed to outmaneuver his attackers while gathering evidence that would ensure they faced serious consequences. Edmund explained that his military service during the Korean War had taught him the importance of patience and planning when confronting enemies who had superior position or resources. The most touching part of our conversation was when Edmund explained his motivations for protecting me and holding my parents accountable. He said that watching them betray family trust had convinced him that some people were incapable of change without facing serious consequences. Edmund believed that exposing their crimes publicly would force Robert and Diana to confront the reality of their actions while sending a message to other potential elder abusers that such behavior would not be tolerated. Edmund also expressed hope that facing criminal charges might eventually lead my parents to genuine remorse and rehabilitation. He acknowledged that sending his own children to prison was heartbreaking, but he believed that accountability was necessary for any possibility of healing the family relationships they had destroyed through their greed and manipulation. The will reading took place on a gray October morning in Harrison's downtown Hartford office. The conference room was elegant and formal, with dark wood paneling, leather chairs, and oil paintings of distinguished judges and attorneys. Robert and Diana arrived dressed in black mourning clothes, maintaining solemn expressions that masked their obvious excitement about inheriting Edmund's wealth. I sat quietly beside my parents as Harrison began reading the formal language of Edmund's last will and testament. The document contained standard provisions for funeral arrangements and personal belongings, but I could see Robert and Diana growing impatient as Harrison worked through the preliminary sections. They exchanged meaningful glances when Harrison mentioned that the bulk of Edmund's estate would be distributed according to specific instructions. When Harrison reached the section detailing individual bequests, he paused dramatically before announcing that Edmund had left me a personal inheritance of $19 million. The lawyer reached into his desk drawer and produced an official-looking check made out to Catherine Marie Collins for exactly that amount. As he slid the check across the polished conference table toward me, I could feel the tension in the room change completely. Robert and Diana stared at the check with undisguised shock and fury. Diana's face turned red as she demanded to know why Edmund would give such an enormous amount to his granddaughter while leaving his own children with nothing. Robert stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor, and began shouting about the unfairness of Edmund's decision and questioning whether the old man had been mentally competent when he signed the will. I reached for the check, but before I could touch it, Diana lunged across the table and snatched it from my hands. Her gold lighter appeared instantly as she flicked it open and held the flame to the corner of the check. Robert grabbed my wrist to prevent me from interfering while Diana watched the paper curl and blacken, dropping the burning fragments onto the marble surface of the conference table. Throughout this explosive scene, I maintained my composure, sitting back in my chair with a calm smile spreading across my face. My parents interpreted my reaction as shock or resignation, but I was actually feeling a deep sense of satisfaction that Edmund's plan was unfolding exactly as he had predicted. Diana and Robert had just demonstrated their true character in front of witnesses while being recorded by hidden cameras. Harrison appeared appropriately distressed by the destruction of the check, asking my parents how he would explain the situation to the bank and whether they understood the legal implications of destroying someone else's financial instruments. Diana smugly told him that family resources should be shared equally rather than concentrated in the hands of one inexperienced young woman who would probably waste the money on frivolous purchases. Robert lectured me about respecting parental authority and suggested that I should have immediately offered to divide the inheritance with them rather than greedily accepting such a large amount for myself. He claimed that Edmund must have been confused when he made such an unbalanced distribution, and that any fair person would recognize the need to correct his mistake. I listened to their self-righteous explanations without responding, knowing that their words were being recorded and would be used as evidence of their criminal mindset. After several minutes of hearing them justify stealing from their own daughter, I decided it was time to spring Edmund's trap and reveal the true nature of the situation. I stood up calmly and walked to Harrison's desk, where I retrieved a small remote control that had been hidden in the top drawer. When I pressed the button, mechanical panels slid away from the walls to reveal large screens that had been concealed throughout the room. The screens immediately began displaying live footage from multiple hidden cameras that had been recording every moment of the will reading. Robert and Diana watched in horror as they saw themselves on the screens, their faces clearly visible as Diana ripped the check from my hands and Robert held my arm to prevent me from stopping her. The cameras had captured every word of their angry demands about the inheritance and their subsequent justifications for destroying what they believed was my legitimate property. I explained that the cameras had been streaming everything to a secure server, creating a permanent digital record of their attempted theft that could never be deleted or destroyed. Harrison added that copies of the footage were being automatically transmitted to law enforcement agencies and would serve as primary evidence in criminal prosecutions against them. Harrison then unlocked a different desk drawer and removed a thick manila folder containing photocopies of every forged document, every fraudulent financial transaction, and every piece of evidence that Edmund had collected during months of documenting their systematic abuse. He explained that identical copies had already been delivered to the district attorney's office, the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, and the state prosecutor specializing in elder abuse cases. I told my parents that the check they had just burned was printed on worthless paper and drawn on a bank account that had been closed for 3 years. The check had no monetary value whatsoever, but their willingness to steal it from me and destroy it in front of witnesses provided perfect evidence of their criminal intentions and complete lack of moral boundaries. Robert's face went pale as he realized they had been manipulated into revealing their true nature. while Diana began screaming that I had betrayed my own family and destroyed any chance of maintaining relationships with my parents. I calmly explained that they had destroyed our family relationships through their systematic abuse of Edmund and their willingness to steal from anyone who trusted them. The office door opened, and Detective Sarah Chen entered with 2 uniformed police officers. Detective Chen announced that arrest warrants had been issued for Diana Marie Collins and Robert James Collins on charges including elder financial abuse, fraud, forgery, identity theft, and grand larceny. The charges carried potential sentences of up to 20 years in prison and complete financial restitution to their victims. As the officers handcuffed my parents, Diana continued screaming that I was an ungrateful traitor who had chosen money over family loyalty. Robert remained silent, staring at the floor with the defeated expression of someone who finally understood that their carefully constructed lies had completely collapsed. I watched them being led away in custody, feeling sad about the destruction of our family, but satisfied that justice was finally being served for Edmund and their other victims. Detective Chen asked me to accompany her to the police station to provide formal testimony about my parents' crimes. As we left Harrison's office, I looked back at the conference room where my childhood illusions about my parents had been permanently shattered, knowing that despite the pain of this moment, I had chosen truth and justice over family loyalty based on deception and abuse. At the police station, Detective Chen led me through a maze of gray corridors to a small interview room with fluorescent lighting and metal furniture. As I provided detailed testimony about my parents' systematic abuse of Edmund, I learned that their criminal activities extended far beyond what I had discovered. The investigation had uncovered evidence that Robert had been using his insurance agency as a vehicle for targeting other elderly clients for sophisticated financial exploitation. Detective Chen showed me files containing documentation of at least 12 additional victims who had been systematically robbed by my parents over the previous 4 years. Robert had developed a carefully planned approach to identifying lonely, wealthy, elderly people who could be manipulated into trusting him with their financial affairs. He would begin by selling them legitimate insurance policies, then gradually build relationships that allowed him to gain access to their broader financial situations. The detective explained that Robert would identify elderly clients who appeared isolated from their families or who expressed concerns about their relatives' financial responsibility. He would position himself as a trusted advisor and father figure, offering to help them protect their assets from children or grandchildren who might waste their inheritance. Once he had gained their confidence, Robert would pressure them into making him the beneficiary of their life insurance policies, and sometimes their entire estates. Diana played a crucial supporting role in these schemes, visiting the victims regularly under the pretense of providing companionship and caregiving services. While building emotional relationships with the elderly targets, Diana would search their homes for valuable items that could be stolen without immediate detection. She had taken antique jewelry, family heirlooms, rare coins, and cash from multiple victims, always choosing items that wouldn't be missed quickly. One particularly heartbreaking case involved a retired teacher named Florence Patterson, who had lost over $300,000 to my parents' scheme. Florence had no children and had trusted Robert to manage her retirement investments after he convinced her that financial markets were too complicated for her to understand. Over 2 years, Robert had systematically transferred Florence's savings into accounts he controlled while providing her with fake statements showing modest investment growth. Florence's nephew had discovered the theft only when he visited her unexpectedly and noticed that valuable family jewelry was missing from her home. When he investigated further, he found evidence that Florence had been giving large amounts of money to Robert and Diana, believing she was making wise investments for her future security. The emotional trauma of discovering the betrayal had caused Florence to suffer a minor stroke, and she was now living in an assisted care facility. Another victim was Harold Wright, a retired postal worker who had signed over his entire pension to Robert after Diana convinced him that his daughter was planning to steal his money and put him in a nursing home against his will. Harold had been living on Social Security payments while Robert collected over $4,000 monthly from Harold's pension fund. The scheme was discovered only when Harold's daughter visited and found him eating expired food because he couldn't afford groceries. Detective Chen showed me recorded phone conversations between my parents where they discussed which victims had the most accessible assets and how to accelerate their access to larger amounts of money. In one particularly disturbing recording, Diana suggested that they could speed up inheritance timelines by convincing elderly targets to stop taking their heart medications, claiming that modern drugs were unnecessary and potentially harmful. The evidence included detailed spreadsheets, where Robert tracked each victim's assets, health status, and family relationships. He had developed profiles showing which elderly people were most vulnerable to manipulation, and which approaches would be most effective for gaining their trust. The spreadsheets also contained notes about how to isolate victims from family members who might interfere with the exploitation schemes. I learned that my parents had stolen a combined total of over $2 million from their elderly victims through various fraudulent schemes. In addition to direct theft of money and valuables, they had convinced several victims to take out loans against their homes, with Robert serving as the beneficiary if the victims died before repaying the debt. The systematic nature of their crimes demonstrated that what they had done to Edmund was part of a much larger pattern of predatory behavior. Detective Chen explained that elder financial abuse was one of the fastest-growing crimes in America, with perpetrators typically being family members or trusted caregivers who had access to victims' personal information and financial accounts. The average victim lost over $120,000, and many never recovered financially or emotionally from the betrayal. Most cases went unreported because victims were ashamed to admit they had been deceived by people they trusted. The detective praised my decision to document and report my parents' crimes, explaining that many elder abuse cases were difficult to prosecute because victims were reluctant to testify against family members or lacked concrete evidence of the theft. The comprehensive documentation I had provided, combined with Edmund's recorded evidence, would make it possible to hold my parents accountable for all of their crimes while helping their other victims recover some of their stolen assets. Harrison arrived at the police station during my interview and informed me that civil attorneys representing the other victims wanted to coordinate with Edmund's case in filing a comprehensive lawsuit against Robert and Diana. The combined damages from all victims could result in judgments exceeding $5 million, ensuring that my parents would face both criminal penalties and complete financial destruction as consequences for their systematic abuse of elderly people. I agreed to cooperate fully with both criminal and civil proceedings, understanding that holding my parents accountable was not just about justice for Edmund, but about protecting future potential victims from their predatory schemes. Detective Chen assured me that the evidence was overwhelming, and that my parents would likely face substantial prison sentences even if they decided to plead guilty and cooperate with investigators. As I left the police station that afternoon, I felt emotionally drained but morally certain that exposing my parents' crimes had been the right decision. The scope of their abuse was far greater than I had imagined, and the suffering they had caused to multiple families demanded serious consequences. I also felt grateful that Edmund's strategic planning had made it possible to document their crimes thoroughly and ensure they couldn't escape accountability through denial or manipulation. 3 weeks after my parents' arrest, Harrison called to schedule a meeting about settling Edmund's actual estate. I assumed we would be discussing the transfer of the family farm, Edmund's house, and perhaps a modest amount of savings that had survived my parents' theft. As I sat in Harrison's office on a crisp November morning, I was completely unprepared for what he was about to reveal about the true scope of Edmund's wealth. Harrison smiled warmly as he slid a comprehensive financial portfolio across the table, explaining that Edmund had been far more financially sophisticated than anyone in the family realized. The documents showed that my grandfather had been a brilliant investor who had transformed his modest farming income into a substantial fortune through decades of careful stock market investments, real estate acquisitions, and precious metals accumulation. I discovered that Edmund had been buying stock in technology companies throughout the 1980s and 90s, when most people considered such investments too risky or complicated to understand. His early investments in companies like Microsoft, Apple, and Intel had grown exponentially over the decades, creating a portfolio worth over $15 million. Edmund had also purchased rental properties in Connecticut, Massachusetts, Vermont, and New Hampshire, taking advantage of depressed real estate prices during economic recessions to build a diversified property empire. The family farm itself was valued at $8 million, not because of the agricultural land, but because Edmund owned valuable mineral rights that extended deep underground. A geological survey had discovered significant deposits of granite and limestone that could be quarried for construction projects throughout New England. Edmund had never mentioned these mineral rights because he had no intention of allowing mining operations on property that had been in our family for generations. Edmund's house and the surrounding 50 acres were worth over $3 million due to their location near rapidly expanding Hartford suburbs. Harrison explained that several developers had approached Edmund over the years with offers to purchase the property for residential development, but he had refused all proposals because he wanted to preserve the rural character of the land where he and Margaret had built their life together. But the most surprising revelation was that Edmund had been accumulating gold, silver, and rare coins for over 40 years, storing them in safety deposit boxes at banks throughout Connecticut. The precious metals collection was worth over $6 million at current market prices, representing a hedge against inflation and economic instability that Edmund had begun building during the uncertain economic climate of the 1970s. Harrison showed me documentation proving that Edmund's total estate was valued at $43 million, making me one of the wealthiest young women in Connecticut. However, Edmund had structured his estate not simply to transfer wealth, but to ensure it would be used responsibly and productively. Rather than giving me direct control over the entire amount, he had created multiple trusts that would provide substantial annual income while preserving the principal for future generations and charitable purposes. The trust structure was designed to generate over $2 million in annual income for me, enough to live comfortably while pursuing meaningful career goals without the pressure of immediate financial concerns. The trusts also funded scholarship programs for young women pursuing business degrees, supported elder abuse prevention organizations, and maintained the family farm as a historical preserve that would never be developed commercially. Harrison explained that Edmund had spent the final months of his life working with estate planning attorneys and tax specialists to create a structure that would minimize tax obligations while maximizing the positive impact of his wealth. The trusts were irrevocable and protected from any legal challenges my parents might attempt from prison, ensuring that their criminal behavior couldn't interfere with Edmund's charitable intentions. As Harrison played a video message that Edmund had recorded for me several weeks before his death, I was moved to see my grandfather sitting in his favorite leather chair, looking directly into the camera with the sharp, intelligent eyes I remembered from childhood. Edmund explained that he was proud of my integrity and courage in exposing my parents' crimes, qualities that convinced him I would use inherited wealth responsibly and ethically. Edmund's video message included specific guidance about using the trust income to establish a foundation focused on elder abuse prevention and education. He encouraged me to work with law enforcement agencies and healthcare organizations to develop programs that would help elderly people protect themselves from financial exploitation while ensuring that abusers faced serious consequences for their crimes. The video also contained Edmund's encouragement for me to pursue my dream of starting my own marketing company, emphasizing that he believed I had the intelligence, creativity, and character necessary to build a successful business that could make positive contributions to the community. Edmund explained that true wealth came from using resources to create opportunities for others rather than simply accumulating possessions for personal enjoyment. Edmund concluded his message by expressing hope that my parents would eventually acknowledge their mistakes and work toward redemption, but he emphasized that accountability was necessary before any healing of family relationships could occur. He reminded me that forgiveness didn't require accepting continued abuse or allowing criminals to escape consequences for their actions. As I sat in Harrison's office, watching my grandfather's final words to me, I felt overwhelmed by his generosity and wisdom. Edmund had not only protected me financially, but had provided a framework for using inherited wealth to make meaningful contributions to society. The responsibility felt enormous. But I was inspired by his confidence in my ability to honor his legacy, while creating my own path forward. Harrison handed me keys to safety deposit boxes, property deeds, and investment account information, explaining that I would need several weeks to fully understand the scope of what Edmund had left me. He also provided contact information for the team of financial advisors, attorneys, and accountants who had been helping Edmund manage his complex estate. The meeting concluded with Harrison expressing his personal commitment to helping me navigate the challenges of sudden wealth, while ensuring that Edmund's charitable intentions were fulfilled according to his exact specifications. As I left his office that afternoon, I realized that my grandfather's death had marked not just the end of his remarkable life, but the beginning of a new chapter in mine, filled with opportunities to honor his memory through meaningful work and responsible stewardship of the resources he had entrusted to me. 6 months later, I stood in the renovated offices of Collins Strategic Marketing on the 20th floor of a downtown Hartford office building, looking out through floor-to-ceiling windows at the Connecticut River Valley where I had grown up. My company specialized in helping nonprofit organizations reach potential donors and increase community engagement, Combining my marketing expertise with my passion for social justice causes that had emerged from witnessing firsthand the devastating effects of elder abuse. The business had grown rapidly beyond my expectations as word spread throughout New England about our innovative approaches to cause marketing and ethical business practices. We had developed successful campaigns for domestic violence shelters, food banks, environmental conservation groups, and educational foundations, creating marketing strategies that authentically communicated each organization's mission while respecting the dignity and intelligence of their target audiences. Our client roster included several organizations focused on elder abuse prevention, and I had discovered that my personal experience with this issue gave me unique insights into developing messaging that resonated with both elderly people and their adult children. We had created educational materials that helped families recognize warning signs of financial exploitation while providing practical steps for protecting vulnerable relatives from predatory schemes. The Edmund Mitchell Foundation for Elder Protection had become the centerpiece of my philanthropic work, operating from beautifully renovated offices on the ground floor of Edmund's farmhouse. The foundation provided legal assistance to elderly abuse victims, funded research into prevention strategies, and offered educational programs for families, healthcare workers, and financial institutions. We had already helped prevent financial abuse in 47 documented cases, providing early intervention that saved elderly people from losing their life savings to unscrupulous relatives and caregivers. Detective Sarah Chen had joined the foundation as our investigative coordinator after retiring from police work, bringing her extensive experience in financial crimes to our mission of protecting elderly people from exploitation. Together, we had developed protocols that banks, investment firms, and insurance companies could use to identify suspicious account activity that might indicate elder abuse. Several major financial institutions had adopted our guidelines as standard operating procedures. The foundation also funded a hotline staffed by trained counselors who could provide immediate assistance to elderly people experiencing financial abuse or family members concerned about potential exploitation. The hotline had received over 3,000 calls during its first 6 months of operation, connecting victims with legal resources, social services, and emotional support during their recovery process. I maintained a difficult but important routine of visiting my parents once monthly at the Connecticut Correctional Institution, where they were serving concurrent sentences of 4 to 7 years for their crimes against Edmund and their other victims. Diana had initially refused to see me, angry that my testimony had been crucial in securing their convictions, but she eventually agreed to participate in family counseling sessions facilitated by prison social workers. The counseling sessions were emotionally challenging for all of us, but they had led to some progress in understanding how my parents' financial desperation had led them to rationalize increasingly serious crimes against people who trusted them. Diana had begun expressing genuine remorse for the pain she had caused Edmund and their other victims, acknowledging that her actions had been inexcusable regardless of the financial pressure she was facing. Robert had taken more complete responsibility for initiating their criminal schemes, explaining that his gambling addiction and failed business investments had created the financial crisis that led him to view Edmund's assets as a solution rather than recognizing that theft was never acceptable. He had been participating in addiction counseling and financial literacy programs, hoping to develop healthier approaches to money management and stress relief. Both of my parents were required to pay complete restitution to their victims as part of their sentences, and their personal assets had been liquidated to begin compensating the elderly people they had robbed. While the restitution payments couldn't undo the emotional trauma my parents had caused, several victims had expressed appreciation that their financial losses were being acknowledged and addressed through the criminal justice system. The family farm had been transformed into the Edmund Mitchell Center for Sustainable Agriculture and Financial Education, where high school students from throughout Connecticut could participate in summer programs that taught both farming techniques and responsible money management. The program attracted students from urban areas who had little exposure to agricultural life, as well as rural students who needed practical financial skills for their futures. I had chosen to live in Edmund's beautifully restored farmhouse, surrounded by the apple orchards and vegetable gardens that he had maintained with such care throughout his life. The house felt peaceful and purposeful, filled with memories of my grandfather while serving as headquarters for work that honored his legacy. I had kept many of his personal belongings, including the leather chair where he had recorded his final video message, and the antique desk where he had planned his strategy for exposing my parents' crimes. The property attracted frequent visitors, including several of the elderly people my parents had victimized, who had become like surrogate grandparents in my life. Florence Patterson visited regularly for Sunday dinners, sharing stories about Edmund and celebrating her recovery from the financial trauma my parents had caused. Harold Wright had become the unofficial coordinator of our volunteer vegetable garden, finding purpose and community through growing food for local charity organizations. Harrison Webb continued serving as my attorney and had become a trusted mentor in navigating the complex legal and financial decisions required to manage substantial inherited wealth responsibly. He often remarked that Edmund would be proud of how I had used my inheritance to create positive change rather than simply enjoying personal luxury, and he helped ensure that every financial decision aligned with the values Edmund had demonstrated throughout his life. The foundation had also begun funding research into the psychological and social factors that led family members to abuse elderly relatives, working with universities and social service agencies to develop better prevention and intervention strategies. Early findings suggested that financial education, family communication training, and accessible mental health services could significantly reduce the likelihood of elder abuse occurring within families. As I reflected on the transformation that had occurred since that shocking day in Harrison's office, I realized that Edmund's smile during the will reading had represented not just satisfaction with outsmarting my parents, but the beginning of a life dedicated to protecting others and using resources for meaningful purposes. The $19 million check my parents had burned had been worthless paper, but the real inheritance Edmund had left me was worth far more than money. The foundation had recently received requests from organizations in other states asking for assistance in replicating our elder abuse prevention programs, suggesting that our work was beginning to have impact beyond Connecticut. I felt deeply satisfied knowing that the pain my family had experienced was being transformed into protection for other families facing similar challenges. Standing in my office that evening, reading letters from families who had been helped by our programs, I understood that true justice came not from revenge against my parents, but from ensuring that other elderly people would be protected from the kind of exploitation Edmund had endured. My smile during the will reading had been the beginning of a journey toward healing, accountability, and meaningful work that honored both my grandfather's memory and the values he had taught me throughout my life. Edmund had shown me that wisdom and integrity were worth more than any amount of money, but he had also given me the financial resources necessary to turn those values into action. The greatest gift he had left me wasn't wealth, but the opportunity to use that wealth in service of justice and protection for vulnerable people who deserve to live their golden years with dignity and security. Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted was taking advantage of you or a loved one? And if so, how did you find the courage to stand up for what was right? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and share it with others who might benefit from hearing about the importance of protecting elderly family members from financial abuse. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about justice, family resilience, and the courage to do what's right, even when it's difficult. Thank you for listening, and remember that sometimes the greatest strength comes from standing up for those who can no longer protect themselves.